you for coming to this session. This is Alexander Clark Stories, History Revealed through Old Newspapers. So hopefully you're in the right spot. My name is Lauren Bradley. I'm the National Register Coordinator at SHPO in Iowa, and I'm here to moderate the session and introduce Mr. Daniel Clark. So Dan Clark came to Muscatine in 1982 and worked a dozen years as a foundation program officer before embarking on a series of writing and consulting projects. 1 year as a reporter for the daily newspaper stirred his interest in an area history as he covered the startup of the city's Historic Preservation Commission, on which he later served 2 terms. He started and ran Muscatine Trolley and Tours for 8 years, during which he hosted a weekly radio program. He is a board member of the Alexander Clark Foundation, preserving the legacy of Iowa's equal rights pioneer. Thank you and welcome, Dan.
The Alexander Clark Foundation, which I serve on, which is 3 of us former chairpersons of the Muscatine Historic Preservation Commission are all on this board. The president of our community college, she hosts, or the college for about a dozen years has hosted a series of lectures and cultural events they call the Alexander Clark series. She sent videographer. I want to thank Jeremy Ferguson, who's here. I told my wife I hoped I didn't embarrass myself because I hope this is going to be on YouTube for the people who made other choices for this hour. And I want to thank the Muscatine Art Center, our local history museum, art and history museum. I'm surrounded, I'm in this forest of stand-up panels, and at the back by Jeremy, there's another panel that's really interesting for preservationists, especially titled Saving the Alexander Clark House, because it has been moved about 200 feet from its original site, and it was a federal project, so it was very interesting. HUD was in a hurry to get it built, or else Muscatine's going to lose its money. And preservationists were coming out of the woodwork saying, blah, 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 that somebody important lived there. And besides, it's architecturally interesting, and it's from the 1870s, and it was built by a wealthy black man. Who ever heard of such a thing? A black man, Alexander Clark, who arguably, and maybe there's no argument, the most prominent African-American resident of Iowa in the 19th century, or certainly until he died in 1891, until the last decade. I resisted the temptation to do a PowerPoint. I've done various PowerPoints on this topic. I'm not satisfied with any of them, and maybe by next year I could offer a PowerPoint. I saw the one Joy did this morning in here talking about the Second Baptist Church, and I aspire to be that good. I decided, because my topic is about newspaper research and writing, and since I think I present myself better in stuff that I've crafted carefully in the middle of the night than off the cuff, I want to do some reading. So I chose an author event that gets you some readings, and then conversation. I think we're small enough for some conversation, question, answer. Who was Alexander Clark? I want a show of hands. How many came in here feeling you know something about Alexander Clark? But not everyone. And the fascinating thing is that all these years, and I've been doing this for, let's say about 20 years, I've been into this topic. The Iowans who grew up in Muscatine or had some association with Iowa history, not least a retired Iowa Supreme Court Justice, Robert Albee, who has now written a biography that was part of Drake University's 2018 Clark 150 conference, they call it, 150 years since Clark versus the Muscatine schools. Part of the claim to fame is Alexander Clark's lawsuit against the local school system, which went to the Supreme Court. Not because he appealed to the Supreme Court, the district judge ruled in favor of his daughter's right to attend the white school, the white kids, and it was the school board that appealed to the state Supreme Court. So Robert Albee wrote a biography of Alexander Clark that's published in Drake Law Review and was part of that wonderful conference that Drake University did. And so as I was saying, the fascinating thing is to discover people who are really knowledgeable about Iowa history, who say, oh, yeah, I think we heard about that case. We heard that Iowa integrated schools really early. Alexander Clark. And then people who grew up in Muscatine who said, I lived there all my life and I never heard of it. That's changed. Today we have the Susan Clark Junior High School, named for the daughter. I was talking with Barry about the idea that that could be one of those civil rights sites. Certainly it should be. I'm here to talk about Alexander Clark's house, and we of course think it should be listed on everything, although, as I'm going to tell, we made several runs at the Network to Freedom because the National Park Service said, oh, why don't you start there before you pursue your goal of a National Historic Landmark, which I'll say more about that. Get yourself on the Network to Freedom. Well, Alexander Clark, the eulogy at his funeral describes him as a great, courageous leader of the Underground Railroad, on a car with John Brown and whatnot. And there is one well-told story documented early on about an 1848 case, but wasn't strictly Underground Railroad. It was in the open. It was Alexander Clark getting acquainted with the legal system and finding white allies and judges and helping a freedom seeker not be taken back to Missouri. And so, as long as we tried for the Network to Freedom, it never felt quite right. And I'm excited to hear about these other opportunities for recognition. So what I want to do is read excerpts of some of these columns that I've been writing, and we'll get into how that happened. These are numbered. If I'm running too long, I'll skip some. But they tell the story of how I noticed that you don't get continuing education credit for this session, and that's because this isn't going to be technical stuff. This is storytelling. If I could award credit, it would be for serendipity and storycraft, something like that. Start this way. This is from column number 57 in my series, which ran into 78 columns so far. In 2001, I reported the startup of the city's first Historic Preservation Commission. At HPC, I heard of historic stuff that could have been saved if people had known or cared before it was too late, before neglected structures got derided as eyesores or obstacles to progress. Not every old building can be saved or should be saved, they said. Documenting what we have is the first step toward mobilizing resources to be able to save any of them. I enjoyed interviewing Kent Sissel, who served as the only, quotes, certified professional member. Restoration of the historic Alexander Clark House was among his accomplishments. With his guidance, the commission gained necessary training and certification and began making systematic inventories of historic properties. I got hooked. Leaving the newspaper, I jumped into local history for tourism promotion. I got a trolley bus and started giving tours and telling stories, especially the Alexander Clark story about the local court case that ended segregated education in Iowa. Connect the dots, Sissel always said. The early settlers all knew each other, you know. Jump to number 6, where I'm going to tell you a little more about my friend Kent. This gets us back to March 2022. I started this, well, I get to some of it, but the editor of the newspaper contacted me for Black History Month 2022 and said, would you write us a column about local Black history? And I was a little grumpy. I said, you know, I don't know how many times I've done this. It's always February. There's never much space to write. We get as far as saying, well, we integrated public education in Iowa. Alexander Clark lived here. He was really important. Aren't we wonderful? And I wanted to say more, because it's not all wonderful and it's not all simple. So, I mentioned Robert Albee, the Supreme Court Justice. In 2018, He came to Muscatine, visited with my friend Kent, looked at lots of paper, they shared a lot of stories, and they videotaped something for the community college series. On that video, Kent says, "I've spent the last 40 years, more or less, protecting the legacy of Alexander Clark." I met Kent in 1985 when he operated a bed and breakfast on one side of the historic double house. I've been learning the Clark story a bit at a time ever since. In 2005, I started paying attention in earnest, working on what Kent called Alexander Clark projects. We started a website. He supplied content. I worked on presenting it. History reveals itself over time, he told me, and he still insists to anyone who's interested in recovering the lost history, connect the dots. As webmaster, I soon received a courteous message from the editor of the Christian Recorder, the official newspaper of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, seeking to reprint an article we had linked. "Brother Clark," began the inquiry. It was the first time someone suspected I might be related, maybe even a descendant of the great man. So I imagined. The editor didn't ask, nor did I explain. That wasn't the last time I've been asked about a family connection, nor the first time our project prompted me to explore my views on race and identity. I quickly grew used to the ambiguity and came to enjoy it. A brother by another mother, declared Professor Adrian Wing, the main speaker at the 2019 dedication of the Alexander Clark Room atop Muscatine's strikingly attractive Merrill Hotel and Conference Center. I've claimed the label ever since, repeating the anecdote as opportunity arises. The Muscatine Journal reporting the event, views from the room include his 1878 home and the Clark House apartments built on the home's original site. The hotel website croons, gather your wedding party in our Clark Room, a unique venue offering spectacular river views. Kent is quick to point out that he's not the only keeper of the legacy, that he took over from Betty Verbusen and Aldine Davis, if you know the African American Museum of Iowa in Cedar Rapids. Now, I'm not sure what's happened since the renovation, but certainly until the renovation, the big meeting room there was known as the Aldine Davis Celebration Hall, had her portrait at the entry. She was a Muscatine woman who grew up in southern Iowa. In fact, she was a member of the same Baptist church that our famous opera singer Simon Estes grew up in. She says they sang in the choir together, although she was a generation ahead of him. So Aldine Davis, and I was not going to read something here, she's really the one who rediscovered Alexander Clark after he got lost in history. In the 1950s, living in Muscatine with the Bethel AME, we heard about the Second Baptist Church being the oldest black congregation in Iowa, continuous congregation. That's true, because the first one was Muscatine, 1848-49, and the building in 1851. Bethel AME in Muscatine was the first black congregation in Iowa, and it turned its records over to somebody else only recently. So Aldine Davis did the research and got the mayor of Muscatine in 1958 to declare Alexander Clark Day, and Alexander Clark's daughter-in-law, widow of Alexander Jr., came over from Oskaloosa and presented to Muscatine a copy of the funeral booklet from Alexander Clark's funeral, where we get wonderful stories about his life, including that he was such a champion of the Underground Railroad. So Kent lists all the women involved in reviving this history. And I'm not going to read the list because you probably don't know most of them. One name I will mention is Bertine Motley. I want to come back to her. She was from Cedar Rapids, and she was the one at the very last minute, after almost all the preservationists in Muscatine had given up, and the One Register published an article saying that this historic house was about to go down for a HUD high-rise. She flew in and said, she arrived on the scene and said, "I just learned about this story, we're going to save it no matter what." She deserves a lot more credit than she's got so far. So many women, interestingly. Women haven't taken all the important roles in the effort, but it's fitting to note them in Women's History Month. I was writing this in March. Having stretched my tail on past the end of Black History Month, like Scheherazade, I'm thinking, But I'm old, so maybe more like I'm binge watching episode after episode until a cliffhanger ends the season. '72 is close to the end of the series. Lorinda, I didn't know you would be my host in this room. Please don't take offense. This is all complimentary. This column was titled, Cascading Through History. What will it take to get Muscatine's Alexander Clark House declared a National Historic Landmark? From Guidelines for Preparing National Historic Landmark Nominations 2023, nationally significant properties embody stories that have exceptional value to the nation as a whole. The history embodied in NHLs may not always be familiar, but their significance to the nation means that they are no less deserving of recognition. Our city's Historic Preservation Commission didn't expect a national significance hurdle. Back in 2010, when we received a grant to hire an expert in U.S. legal history to help us make the case to the U.S. National Park Service. I was HPC chairperson at the time. Not far into the project, the feds told us it wasn't good enough that our Alexander Clark House had been listed on their National Register of Historic Places in 1976 as a U.S. bicentennial project. No, they pronounced Clark's significance established at state level only, thus disqualifying our NHL bid until we might win national level certification. Long story short, that hasn't happened yet. It might help, this is a quotation, if you could show a cascading effect from Clark to Brown, advised Lorinda Bradley in a meeting this month. She is Iowa's National Register Coordinator at the State Historic Preservation Office. Thanks to the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966, every state has an SHPO, an expert or staff of experts mediating access to the National Register of Historic Places, which is a program of the NPS. We preservationists pronounce the acronym SHPO. We listen when SHPO speaks. Now, if any of you were in Lorinda's session yesterday morning, you heard that apparently this is a regionalism and we're supposed to say SHPO.
Apparently that's on the East Coast. We say SHPO, but SHPO, and it's common somewhere out for other places.
So in any case,
New Jersey, they said. New Jersey. Yeah.
here in Iowa, we say SHPO. In 1978, the Iowa Division of Historic Preservation, SHPO of the day, intervened against a city threat to demolish the then derelict house. Pat Eckhart told the city council her agency considered it the last physical remembrance of Alexander Clark, whom she described as a man of national significance. When the restorer of the Alexander Clark House, Kent Sissel, introduced me to the preservation process, SHPO was at the State Historical Society in Des Moines, where it was part of the Department of Cultural Affairs. This month, SHPO moved into New Digs as part of the Iowa Economic Development Authority. So back to cascading Clark to Brown. That would mean showing falling dominoes in school desegregation cases from Clark v. Muscatine 1868 to Brown v. Topeka 1954. One victory leading to the next and the next and the next. Can such an argument be made? Maybe. I've heard our legal history expert, Paul Finkelman, react to the upgrade requirement, ticking off half a dozen Clark achievements, saying after each one, if it were only that, but also, as if the evidence is overwhelming. That's easy for him to say. He's not filling out their forms or arguing his way through their process. Speaking at Muscatine Community College in February 2023, he said, bringing this case is not merely changing the law so Clark's daughter can go to school. He is setting up the circumstances to begin to change American law in what will be a very long and painful struggle to reach racial equality in the United States. And then in the column I give a link to where the community college's YouTube. Did you record that one, Jeremy? Who remembers? And then, it's a significant case, he concludes. It should be in the pantheon of American liberty. And then add context, advised SHPO's Bradley. What was happening in other states at the same time? Why Iowa? Why the Clarks? On December 7, a few hours after our SHPO conversation, The Muscatine City Council voted unanimously to endorse the current HPC's proposal for Muscatine to compete for hosting the 2025 Preserve Iowa Summit, a big deal for preservationists statewide. Host cities must have a showcase project as part of the application, so HPC proposes an intensive survey of local sites with possible Underground Railroad significance. The timing could be just right. February 2026 will be Clark's 200th birthday. Also, 2024-2025 is the 50th anniversary of rediscovering Clark and saving the 1878 house from demolition. The interpretive panels made for a major exhibit at Muscatine Arts Center last spring could be used for the summit showcase. Cascading. I've been spinning on the word since that night, and turning points and tipping points. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. John Lewis. Incidentally, each of these 78 columns was 820 words long, and I can't explain that rationally, but having written for the newspaper, I knew about how much I could get away with. When the editor got me to do that first column, I said, so what's my length, about 700 words? He said, sure, that sounds good. I turned in 820, he published it. I said, you know, once isn't enough. I have at least that much more material than me. He says, okay, get it in by Monday and I'll run it Wednesday. And so I just happened to get 820 again. And it became a really good number. And incidentally, if you want to hear a different voice do it, these are all on the Muscatine Journal's website. It's behind a paywall. If you could find them on the website, then you could click a button and a really amazing computer voice will read them to you. Although Iowa, they pronounce Loa. There's other funny stuff. So, in February, in Black History Month of 2024, in a column titled, "We Are What We Celebrate." However vague about particulars, Muscatine proudly claims Mark Twain. We can look around and see decorative reminders of our associations with his greatness. The world knows Mark Twain and his Mississippi River, and he said we were special. I don't know if y'all know that. I mean, in Life on the Mississippi, there's a paragraph where Mark Twain remembers Muscatine fondly for its summer sunsets. The sunrises might have been fine too, but he wouldn't know. And then there's a following line they never quote about. The main thing he remembers about Muscatine was some crazy man who threatened him with a knife. Too bad the house where young Sam Clemens may have lived with his brother and their mother was demolished to make way for a new filling station, itself now long gone. Oh well. Muscatine Journal, April 3, 1940. Muscatine's old Mark Twain home was leveled to the ground today after proposed steps to preserve the little one-story dwelling had been abandoned by city officials. Cost of the moving of the old structure, which was in a badly dilapidated condition, led to dropping of plans for its proposed preservation in Riverside Park. It was estimated that the cost would run to about $1,400, more than it was felt was justified in view of its historical value. Mark Twain, as far as can be learned, lived in the little house near the end of the High Bridge for only a short period of time in 1854, possibly 2 or 3 months at the most. Another resident who became famous, Alexander Clark, no doubt knew Clemens and maybe cut his hair and swapped yarns. He resided here most of his life. Thanks to his initiative and persistence, Iowa outlawed segregated schools. President Benjamin Harrison named him U.S. Minister to Liberia. Celebrating Clark's greatness requires telling his story. Entrepreneur, civil rights advocate, church leader, recruiter of black soldiers, Republican orator, Masonic Grand Master, lawyer, publisher, diplomat, always a champion of equality. In 2026, Black History Month will commemorate the 100th year since the observance began as Negro History Week in 1926. It will be Clark's 200th birthday, too, a celebration to start planning now. Thanks to a 2018 resolution offered by our first African American council member, every February 25 is Alexander Clark Day, our made-to-order Black History Month opportunity. Isn't that lucky for us that Clark was born in February? His story almost got lost. During a 5-year drama, 1974 to 1979, his century-old house got rescued and moved up West 3rd Street to make way for construction of an apartment high-rise. And you've got that whole story in the back. I hope you get a chance to see that. But its future was almost always at risk. The largely black-led campaign to save it was often weeks away from demolition deadlines. The project's leader, Bertine Motley of Cedar Rapids, said the biggest difficulty was getting the Clark story told. Few people knew who he was. Late in the scramble, the director of the State Historic Preservation Office, Adrian D. Anderson, his name came up in the awards yesterday, urged yet another delay of condemnation proceedings. Muscatine Journal, December 21, 1978. Anderson referred to a persisting lack of local support for the preservation project. He called the lack of local support kind of a slap in the face as far as Black history is concerned. Aren't we wonderful? Comparing Alexander Clark with George Washington Carver, Anderson said, Clark was one of the most important blacks that Iowa can lay claim to. He said it is ironic that Clark was celebrated as one of the great historical personalities of the city as recently as 3 decades ago, yet Clark's former house has recently faced almost complete neglect. In 1979, preservationist Kent Sissel accepted a call to return to his hometown and take over the restoration. A white man, he embraced local Black history, collected stories and documents, promoted Alexander Clark educational projects, and made himself available for interviews. He initiated city designation of the Alexander Clark Heritage District on 4 half blocks around the house. He started the Alexander Clark Foundation to protect and preserve the residents and celebrate the legacy of equal rights pioneers. And I should note, the Alexander Clark Heritage District is not a National Register district. The state doesn't recognize it, but our local Historic Preservation Commission recommended it to City Council, and they agreed to it as long as it didn't mean anything. There was no ordinance that said we could enforce any rules or anything like that. And Michael Meharry, who succeeded me in chairing the commission, described it as a decorative district. And we all agree that decorative districts are worth having if you're telling stories. A 2012 PBS documentary, Alexander Clark, Lost in History, remains one of the best introductions to Clark, even though it made the story about Kent to his chagrin. At age 80, he's still at it. We call ourselves the old white guys. I'm only 73. Anyway, he asks that we celebrate Black history as American history, that we celebrate how we're all connected one way or another. Thanks to Alexander Clark, reporters on assignment commemorate Iowa's Black history looking to Muscatine. I think Mark Twain would like that. And it's true. The more of this we've done, the more we get. Last year, 2023, we had a television crew from Des Moines, Channel 8 TV in Des Moines. The Quad Cities regularly covers this. Cedar Rapids has covered it. This is all television, and increasingly there are newspaper stories because Iowa reporters on deadline go looking, and what do they find? Happily, they're starting to find Alexander Clark. This is column 34 in October 2022. John Brown's last trip across Iowa was in early 1859. He and his band left Muscatine County by rail in March. He would die at Charlestown, Virginia in December. In February 2009, a speaker at the dedication of the Alexander Clark Conference Room at the Grimes State Office Building in Des Moines asked us to imagine a conversation between Clark and Brown. It's possible they met because Clark gave safe harbor to escaping slaves, and John Brown's trail was only a half-day ride from Clark's home, said Rudy Sims, director of the Des Moines Civil and Human Rights Commission. It was a fun exercise. I think Sims was right. They did know some of the same people, and their activities ran parallel even if they did not connect or intertwine. Because he owns Clark's house, my friend Kent Sissel received a copy of Dr. Bolsoyke's 2007 reply to a National Park Service survey about significant African American historical sites that could warrant consideration as National Historic Landmarks. We were blown away. The NHL designation is reserved for a select few properties nationwide. Lowell had helped persuade Kent to restore the house decades before. Now he was nearing the end of a 36-year career as staff historian at the State Historical Society of Iowa. On behalf of the state, he recommended a single property for the NHL list, the Alexander Clark House. He was also the driving force at the center of the Iowa Freedom Trail project. SHSI, which I learned yesterday, that acronym gets pronounced somehow. Shishi? I love it. I learned something at this Preserve Iowa Summit. Shishi staff and volunteers were leveraging federal transportation dollars to try to discover and document whatever could still be learned about Iowa's part in helping freedom seekers escaping slavery. Although Lowell's NHL recommendation did not pull us into the UGRR work at first, do we pronounce that somehow? Several of us who were telling Clark's story saw a natural fit with the 1848 Jim White case I've told before. And I have. Some of the columns up to this point were focusing on that Underground Railroad stuff. I've written about telling that story in the project's, this is in Lowell Soike's project's 2007 conference. By 2009, I was deep into learning about Bleeding Kansas and its many Iowa angles, and of course, John Brown. Last week I wrote about meeting Dr. Paul Finkelman at Harper's Ferry. Lowell had recommended him because Paul had successfully argued NHL status for Dred Scott's lawyer's house. You got that? Dred Scott's lawyer's house in St. Louis. Paul was a protege of the renowned historian John Hope Franklin, and what we learned of his own prodigious output of books and articles and TV appearances impressed us. Look up Paul Finkelman on C-SPAN Book TV, or, the guys on TV all the time. Thus, my last-minute decision to meet Paul at the John Brown Remembered Symposium on the 150th anniversary of the Harper's Ferry raid. Or in short notice, so I'm going to skip some here, but I really short notice, I went to Harper's Ferry, and Paul Finkelman treated me like his honored guest, and the Iowans were going to commission him to do something really important, and he was going to write the book and make the TV appearances and stuff. He always tells us, well, what you guys really need is, a definitive biography that scholars will respect. And he knows just the guy who will write it. It's like some of your dreams. I hope Paul lives long enough. So I went to Harper's Ferry. I was Paul's guest. My intention had been to go out and join the reenactors, but it was really cold and rainy. Those guys chose the middle of October to do the raid on Harper's Ferry. And it was a nasty night. They started out at the Kennedy Farmhouse over in Maryland and walked across the river and went to the engine house, which has now been moved. You know what? It's still a big deal on the National Register. It's been moved like 4 times, disassembled, moved to Chicago and back, and all sorts of things. But we did end up, and so we spent the evening hanging out. Paul and a few of his friends, he wanted to show off this Iowa project he was going to do. We all sat around and talked John Brown stories. And then about 9 o'clock, we went down to the engine house, and I got to tell you, on the precise 150th anniversary of John Brown's raid, to be inside that building under torchlight with characters dressed from that period was an experience. In any case, we've had this bond with Paul Finkelman ever since. So this column ends that way. I come back to, I wonder how many area residents, this is Eastern Iowa, have ever visited Iowa's Underground Railroad attraction at milepost 270 on eastbound Interstate 80. Have you? Appearing in view off to the right, it used to be my signal to slow down for the Highway 38 off-ramp. When the sign says Weldon, Muscatine, you take a right, you start slowing down, and you roll past this rest area. Time to slow and stay alert for the 2-lane stretch into Muscatine. What I learned when I eventually paid attention was that we locals were overlooking a gem of a teaching tool, the nearest of several art-in-transit rest stops designed by Des Moines artist David Dahlquist. December 22 will be the 20th anniversary of its completion. Go see it, if you haven't, and make a point of finding the picnic shelter featuring the full-bearded John Brown rendered in terracotta. His face is one of many images and elements making the place much more than a pit stop. Notice Tabor, Iowa author Marilyn Robinson's fictional Gilead, at the western fence, and Fort Sumter at the east, like bookends of an Iowa anti-slavery story. There was more of that, but Underground Railroad tourism. 60, this is a couple weeks later. Oh, in between I told the story, I was discussing with somebody yesterday about John Brown and the band. You all know the thing, I hope you all know the famous story of John Brown's last trip across Iowa, with folks liberated from Missouri and brazenly, openly brought across the state of Iowa, hosted all the way by prominent people and hidden out some places. And anyway, 16 historic, so I had, in the intervening week, I had done a column, John Brown and West Liberty, that was only about what happened in our county. And then 16 historical markers across Iowa tell the story of John Brown's last Underground Railroad trip, February 4 to March 10, 1859, from Civil Bend near the Missouri River to the Mississippi's edge at Davenport. The marker I know best stands outside historic West Liberty Railway Depot. Its post is well cemented into ballast rock. I know, having dug much of the hole myself in June 2009. I say it's my most concrete contribution to the Iowa Freedom Trail, of which the John Brown Freedom Trail is a subset. Lowell Soike conceived and led the overall project for the State Historical Society, for Shishi. Early on, he and his team concluded that whatever buildings or structures might once have been identified as having significant association with the illegal clandestine activities of Iowa's UGRR simply no longer existed. Instead, the Shishi team would focus on collecting documents and stories along with doing some archaeology. They would get acquainted with the likely actors. They would map and chart and analyze family and business connections, settlement patterns, religious and fraternal associations, political activities, and so forth. Because of our Alexander Clark research, Lowell introduced several of us Muscatine people to Doug Jones and John Zeller and others doing the UGRR legwork. We joined the quest and shared in their adventures for several years. Eventually becoming the team leader, Doug was first an archaeologist. One of my favorite times with him was an exploration with ground-penetrating radar, which he led at a cemetery near the Cedar County farm where Brown's men trained in 1858. We sifted old newspapers for Muscatine clues. Who might have done stuff? That's what Doug always said. I think they did stuff. And what did they do? Fellow volunteer Steve Hankin and I created the Facebook group Underground Railroad West, where folks around the region are still sharing stories and theories and event notices. As the Shishi funding ran out and staffing ended, Lowell gathered the project's findings into the pair of books I consider the best sources for students of the topic. I hope you know Lowell's books. I'm not going to read that now. Skipping a whole lot. We volunteers later on busy in our cause. Busy in the Cause was the name of one of Lowell's books. For a while, Muscatine activists shifted focus from seeking National Historic Landmark recognition of Clark's house to getting it listed on the National Underground Railroad Network for Freedom. The National Park Service advised going that route as a step toward our NHL goal. Working with Dave Johnson, Network for Freedom Midwest Regional Manager, and Doug Jones at Shishi, we assembled documentation and made considerable efforts in that direction. Suddenly, Doug died, much too young. Losing Doug's enthusiasm, our effort faltered. Our enthusiasm went. I've almost finished the assigned readings, and then I have all the optional ones you want, but we can chat, please. Number 28. From September 2022. Across a crowded lobby, I recognized Iowa's one-time state architectural historian who married a candidate for Congress. It's one of the opening events at the spectacular new Stanley Museum of Art. She is serving as a greeter. Calling card in hand, I make my way to her side. Scribble on the back, Alexander Clark House. She glances at the words. That is one of my favorite places, she says. A young professional designer returned to his hometown to save the historic house. He's still at it, 40 plus years later. I am a board member of the foundation Kent Sissel created for long-term preservation of the house and the legacy of the equal rights pioneer who built it. I asked Kent, now 78, he was 80 this February, he was 78 then, to tell again how he got involved in what became his life work. I knew he did it instead of completing PhD work at Penn State. All but dissertation, he said. I left my education. Muscatine Journal, March 9, 1979. Representatives of the Alexander Clark Historical Society announced Thursday that the former home of Clark has been tentatively sold to Kent Sissel of Muscatine, a historic preservationist who has several other restoration projects to his credit. The group that moved the 1878 house to make way for a high-rise apartment building had missed several deadlines for correcting code violations at the new location. The city council was poised to order demolition when young Sissel appeared. Pat Eckhart of the Iowa Division of Historic Preservation addressed the council and said her agency considers the house the last physical remembrance of Alexander Clark, whom she described as a man of national significance. Deepa Foxley asked me to take on the troubled project, Kent said. I found a journal report, August 10, 1974, telling that a team of preservationists will conduct a two-week survey of Iowa cities along the Mississippi River. 2 of those days will focus on Muscatine. Traveling with representatives of the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Register of Historic Places will be Adrian Anderson, the archaeologist who was Iowa's first historic preservation officer, and Miss Elizabeth Foxley, architectural historian of the Iowa State Historic Preservation Program. Miss Foxley and Kent Sissel of Muscatine will present a program to the Kiwanis Club. From a letter in the journal, May 14, 1976, Muscatine has much to celebrate and conserve, from the handsome courthouse and precious one-of-a-kind county jail to the Victorian residences and rural structures. Muscatine County has a unique character. Signed, Elizabeth Foxley Leach, Mrs. James A.S. Leach. Deepa Foxley Leach left her post and listened to my story of Kent and our quest for national recognition, of my Black History Month column that turned into this weekly project. I said I wanted her to verify Kent's claim that she got him into all this. I can claim I did that, she said. Then she added, thanks for keeping the flame alive. I choked up that day, and I choked up now. I went back to Kent for more. How did he get chosen? Oh, they were consultants on my master's thesis, he said. Adrian and Deepa and Lowell Soike. Lowell was the state historian. So Deepa tapped him, and all 3 talked him into it. In a column several months ago, I told of our National Historic Landmark goal and the problem of establishing national significance versus the state level, which is how the feds view Alexander Clark. To that end, we've engaged, another name in vain, we've engaged Rebecca Lewin McCarley, one of the state's best consultants, who's led projects that gained National Register recognition for several Muscatine area properties and districts. When I said I'd like to write about her, she replied, in terms of publicizing the steps for the Clark House, I would just caution you on not overstating what step we are at currently, i.e. to complete research and determine a national case for significance per National Register standards. Building on that case, she said, would be a precursor to a potential National Historic Landmark listing. And I heard in another session this morning that Rebecca's the one we all hire to say, slow down. Kent told a journal reporter, February 2012, I'm retired and tired. I've probably got 100 projects I could pursue. Every day I try to push one of those projects a little further. I am still pursuing the idea that the property be institutionalized and used for educational purposes and no longer as a residence. I think we are headed in that direction. That one goes on a bit further. Last one I'm scheduled to read. And then depending on your interest in topics, I can go to some others. Because I haven't actually shared much of the newspapers.com research here. Many of my columns have been to discover some nugget that I thought either I was the first one to find it or no, who else knows this stuff? This is important. So that's what a lot of my columns are about. But the very last one I wrote, which was rejected the first time I submitted it. And so this language isn't exactly negotiated, but it was after lunch with the editor, I submitted this one and it was published. They titled it An End and a Beginning. You are reading column number 78 in a series I had no inkling of when editor David Hodel asked me to write a column for Black History Month 2022. To me, that meant a single piece about Muscatine's extraordinary 19th century black hero, Alexander Clark. I had performed the ritual before for the journal and others, so I do it once more because that story is one of my favorite things about living here. There is so much more to be told about Muscatine's part in black history, I wrote. 1 month is never enough. After turning it in, I sent this note. David, let me know if you want another column before the end of the month. We are planning an Alexander Clark Day event, probably at Muscatine Community College, that I could report. Plus, I thought of other topics in the course of writing the one I submitted. He replied, sounds great to me. If you want to write another guest column, we'd be more than happy to have it. A month later, after publishing 4, and with number 5 in the works, he invited me to become a regular columnist. He obliged when I suggested a no-money handshake deal. Now, over time, we've negotiated the deal further, and until almost the end, I really had everything I wanted. People who were in a hurry assigned titles that didn't really fit what I'd written, and I said, you know what, could I suggest my titles? And they almost always used them. I was using quotations that ran very long. One paragraph would run very long, and so the deal was, if I put it in quotation marks and cite a source, you're not going to chunk it up. You're not going to apply AP-style guidelines, rules, all sorts of things like that. It was a fun experience. Dave has been wonderful to work with, encouraging, supportive, accommodating. He went along with my wish to choose my own headlines, so I was able to announce what was coming next time. Researching 19th century archives and imagining life through the eyes of those writers, I started feeling akin to serial scribblers like Dickens and Stowe. Expressing anything having to do with so-called race, skin color, prejudice, power imbalance, sins of history, all that, can be a tricky deal. A bundle of topics fraught with differing perceptions and sensibilities and narratives, a can of worms, as they used to say. Historic language has been a big part of this story. I've done my best to tell. Dave has allowed quaint wording, very long sentences and paragraphs, and especially important to me, he has let me quote things we would not say today. We had no disagreement about substituting N-word for the most offensive slur, which I wouldn't have wanted to say anyway. Reader response has been overwhelmingly positive, and I'm truly grateful for the platform and audience the journal has provided for 2 years plus. It's been a privilege to showcase Clark via his main local newspaper. Dave and I discussed how to explain our recent mutual decision to end the series, and we agreed, I can say, it's complicated. It's the modern way. Des Moines journalist Laura Balin has republished these columns from the start in her Bleeding Heartland blog. Her reply when I asked if I might continue, of course, I love publishing this series, and I don't have the same word limits they do. About a year ago, I collected the first 52 columns into a little book, which I plan to reissue with the addition of the next 26 or more. It looks like this. I expect to write more about Alexander Clark, especially his roles in church and Masonic orders, and his times in Chicago and Liberia. And I want to examine my own views about race as a white male who's lived, or pig, or whatever you want, who's lived most of his 70-plus years in Iowa. Reporters ask why Clark is still so little known, or what could change that. I say it's a story that must be told again and again, especially during Black History Month. His name was not immediately forgotten when he died in May 1891. In early 1892, his body was returned from Liberia and buried with honors at Muscatine's Greenwood Cemetery. Newspapers all around the country reported his death, but a typo caused too many to misidentify him as ex-minister to Siberia. And when daughter Rebecca died in 1906 and her body was returned from Chicago for burial in the family plot, the Journal reported her father as foreign missionary to Liberia. Until I went looking a few weeks ago, I did not realize how long it took our community to erect the gravestone we see today. Muscatine Journal, January 20, 1904. Remember, he died 1891. His body was returned by the State Department in 1904. That the grave of this famous representative of the colored race should be allowed to fall into the alleged state it now exists is, to say the least, deplorable. Muscatine News Tribune, January 31, 1904. A movement has been started by Reverend Phillips of the AME Church of this city to secure funds for the erection of a monument at the grave of Honorable Alexander Clark, one of the brightest and best colored citizens ever known in Iowa. Evidently the movement succeeded, although I found no more details. But if the brightest and best could be so little noted and easily forgotten, what about all the rest, all the lesser knowns? Just imagine how Clark and compatriots might have used 21st century social media with oratory streaming on Facebook and YouTube. Imagine them blogging. You know what? I do want to read you one more because I want to tell you a little more about the argument that ended publication. And I had advertised in the previous column, let's see, this is January 10, 2024. I had announced in the previous column that the next week's column would be titled "A Fine Figure of a Negro," in quotes. A fine figure of a Negro. When I opened my paper that morning, while there were a whole bunch of edits in this thing that Dave and I hadn't negotiated, that I certainly hadn't imagined, the headline, well, they even gave it a teaser on the front page. Remembrances of Alexander Clark, Butler's musings on former Liberia ambassador. And when you got to the opinion page, the column was titled Early Remembrances of Alexander Clark. Now, to me, the central question of the PBS documentary was titled Lost in History. Simon Estes was the narrator. The thread running all the way through it was, if this guy was such a big deal, how come nobody remembers him? And that continues to be the question. So along the way, I keep coming up with things like typos that say he went to Siberia instead of Liberia, and he had no living descendant beyond his children. There are no descendants today that anybody knows of. So we come up with all these reasons why the man might have been forgotten. A century of Jim Crow didn't hurt. But I found various things from early 20th century that shows attitudes prevalent in Muscatine and, of course, everywhere in Iowa. I had two grandfathers in Iowa who were members of the KKK, briefly, in the 1920s. One was a Methodist Sunday school superintendent in Boone, the other was a United Presbyterian minister in southern Iowa, president of his synod, members of the KKK. My parents told me they were both friends of colored people, some of their best friends, but they were keeping the Catholics in their place. So I'm not going to read you the edited version. I'm going to read the one that got submitted. And I guess this is what got the attention of people Dave and I, the editor and I, both referred to as higher-ups. The Muscatine Journal is part of the Lee Enterprises franchise and syndicate. And the higher-ups in Davenport apparently got the last word on what was going to appear in the Muscatine Journal, but I didn't realize that. I thought my deals with Dave were ironclad. So, this is as submitted, a fine figure of a Negro. A celebrated 20th century humorist drew much of his material from memories of growing up in Muscatine. Ellis Parker Butler, 1869 to 1937, struck gold in 1906 with Pigs as Pigs, then kept America laughing for 3 decades. He married his hometown sweetheart, went to New York, and there succeeded as a publisher and banker. Always a part-time author, he wrote at least 32 books and more than 2,000 stories and essays. When he died, a tribute in the New York Herald Tribune described him as a shooting star in the literary firmament, a meteor of such magnitude and brilliance, however, that 30 years after its publication, Pigs as Pigs still wakens cheerful chuckles. Muscatine Journal and News Tribune, September 14, 1937. The pen with which he brought smiles to brighten the faces of countless readers from coast to coast will write no more. The clean humor he created, however, remains. He scattered sunshine while he lived. Which brings me to his yarn based on Alexander Clark's appointment as U.S. Ambassador to Liberia. Then 21, Butler had worked as a bill clerk at Muscatine Spice Mills, and some of his first fiction had been published in the Muscatine News. The Clark yarn makes up about 1/6 of an essay published in Success magazine, December 1923. Beloved humans, it's going to be a great life. I would recite the passage in full, but it's longer than the space allowed for my column. Another man I knew out home was colored too. He's already had fun describing some of the colored people he grew up with. And a fine figure of a Negro. He was in politics. One day the president offered him the job of minister to Liberia. That's how it starts. Then Butler goes into a long, hilarious riff on postage stamps as the main business of the place President Harrison sent Clark. However that may be, it does seem to be a fact that the United States minister to Liberia is not as important as the ambassador to Great Britain. His speeches do not get in the papers as often. Nobody knows whether he wears knee breeches or none. He does not have to lie awake at night wondering how to prevent Liberia from declaring war on the United States. And he does not have to worry about Ireland. It looks like a one-horse job. But to return to Muscatine, although this man was quite an important political figure among the colored voters of Muscatine, Iowa, he did not say, I won't take a ministerial position until I can go to the court of St. James. The minute he was offered the ministership to Liberia, he took it. And in 2 weeks, he was on his way to Monrovia, and in less than 2 months, he was on his way home again, soldered in a lead coffin. And the entire round trip was at the government's expense. It did not cost him a cent. Hold on. Is this mockery or all in good fun? How should we read Mr. Butler? Remember, we are 100 years later, in a more enlightened time. No Jim Crow, no minstrelsy, no writing in demeaning dialect. Oh, Butler was a master of dialect. I mean, you should have seen what he did to Irish and Germans in Muscatine. Butler's humor is loaded with dialect, not only people of color. He caricatures Germans, Irish, and others. In the same year as Pigs, he argues for creative spelling. No man who devotes the fiery days of his youth to learning to spell has time to be a genius. He's quoted in the Atlantic Monthly, June 1906. Back to the Black Ambassador. Now, somebody may scoffingly say, that just shows. If that man had stayed at home, he would not have got swamp fever or whatever killed him, and he would not have needed a coffin, not even an expensive soldered one the angel Gabriel would have to open with a can opener. But that is all wrong. If my old colored friend had hesitated and wondered and worried instead of telegraphing in haste, collect, accepting that Liberian job, there would have been a Democratic administration come in, and he would have fretted and worried for 8 years more, mighty unhappy all the time. Then, when he was so old he could not really enjoy Liberian postage stamps with lizards on them, or any other of the Liberian advantages, such as bare feet and silk hats at the same time, the Republicans would have come in again, and he would have been made minister to Liberia just the same, and the swamp fever would have got him just the same, and he would have come home in a non-refillable waterproof container just the same. The only difference would have been that he would have had 8 years of needless worry, and would have had to pay for food and taxes and rent and upkeep during the entire interim, and at the end of the period, he would have been dead just the same. Clean humor and sunshine. So, the higher-ups were so nervous about that column for some reason that they just edited the heck out of it. I mean, the thing that came out in the newspaper looked nothing like what I was trying to say. And if any reader thought that there was some irony involved, or that I was trying to raise important questions for us today, that was all. Well, there had been previous edits. They started, I didn't know about these higher-ups so much, but they started doing things like, if they saw the word Negro or the word colored, they used today's correct Associated Press style rule, capital B black. Well, I usually use capital B black, and I'm happy to do it, but when you're reading from 1904, or when Alexander Clark is quoted announcing that there's going to be a convention of colored people, what's politically correct? Aren't we saying people of color today? I mean, can we let Alexander Clark talk about the colored people? So Dave and I have already had some conversations, and when this column came out, I said, Dave, that was at least strike two. I don't know about our deal. He said, let's have lunch. And at lunch, he told me things that I won't quote, he'll deny he said them, about the personalities involved, and we both agreed it's a lost cause. If he can't find out the rules, and if I can't find out the rules, I'm not going to keep submitting columns or doing research based on somebody who's in a really big hurry in Davenport saying, that makes me a little nervous, I don't have time to check with the lawyers, so we're going to do this. I could read you more stories, but maybe you want to ask me questions, or maybe you want to react. Anything else, I use newspapers.com, and I got really good at doing searches, keyword searches. And so when I use those, they're cited by date and publication. Early on in the series, I wasn't so focused on the idea that I was digging into the newspaper archive, although, as I wrote early on, the Muscatine Journal is where Alexander Jr., the first black law graduate west of Mississippi from University of Iowa Law School. Alexander Sr. was the second law graduate. He decided, hey, a law degree would be a good thing to have. That was the family newspaper. He worked there before Alexander Jr. and Sr. bought a black newspaper in Chicago, which presaged the Chicago Defender of today. There was the Chicago Conservator, founded by a man named Ferdinand Barnett. If you've heard of Ida B. Wells Barnett, you've heard of Ida B. Wells. I used to work in Chicago. I would just off the Congress Expressway. Today that's Ida B. Wells Expressway. If you drive under the old post office toward Lakeshore Drive, you're on Ida B. Wells. Well, so we have that Alexander Clark connection. After he got his law degree in 1884, he and his son bought in as partners with Ferdinand Barnett. And then later he took it on and published it himself till 1887. And by then, he was the president of the National Press Association, which was the Black Publishers Association, going to national conferences. He, 1 year in Nashville or Louisville, I think it was Nashville. He was on the executive committee, he was on the platform at the convention with Ida B. Wells, who was making a name for herself as a young journalist who was uncovering the stories of lynching before she came north and worked with Frederick Douglass in organizing the black representation at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. So that's the sort of dots that we connect, and I got into deciding that newspapers.com was going to be the main source. At the beginning, I was kind of, who is Alexander Clark, why is he important, telling the story, and telling readers what I thought were good sources. I always started by saying, for me, learning this Underground Railroad, pre and post Civil War Iowa history was Robert Dykstra, Bright Radical Star. I think I've heard that referred to some of the conference here. Leslie Schwalm's Emancipation Diaspora was mentioned to the University of Iowa. She's another one. Although I devoted a column. I wrote several times kind of focused on women's roles. I wrote a lot about the Motley family from Cedar Rapids and their part in saving the house. Why did I start to say that? Writing about women's roles. This is it. I think the first time I wrote about women, I told about Kent Sissel and me attending a lecture by Leslie Schwalm together. We never heard of her. Musser Public Library brought her in to speak, probably Black History Month, and Alexander Clark was somehow on her topic. And we thought, oh, wonderful, a university professor is going to come tell us things we don't know. And so here we were, the old white guys, sitting there waiting to hear about our hero. And I would say we spent most of the evening listening to, how come nobody knows about the older daughter, Rebecca? She didn't integrate schools, but she did important things. And as it turns out, by the way, she was the first black student in Brown College. It's another column's devoted to that. Daughter Rebecca. And what about Catherine, the wife? I mean, so there was a famous Underground Railroad story related to Alexander Clark. I mean, who do you think took charge of hosting this person in their house? Why, of course, it was the wife who was feeding him and changing the bed linens, and you know, the stories are just never centered on women. So we all know about Alexander Clark. A lot of you. Well, here's the old white guys. Whatever. Feminist, you know, intersectionality, blah blah, whatever.
So whatever happened to Susan Clark?
There's a column titled, What Became of Susan Clark? Susan Clark married the young AME pastor who came to town, to the Muscatine's Bethel AME Church. Richard Holly, spelled with E. And he became pretty prominent in the AME in the Midwest. They ended up living most of their married lives in Cedar Rapids. As a matter of fact, if you know where the African American Museum, if you know where Czech Village is, if you know where the Czech and Slovak Museum is, so I bet it's a stone's throw from the Czech and Slovak Museum to the address where the city directors always show Richard and Susan Holly living. Susan described as a dressmaker. But first of all, she was an AME pastor's wife, which meant that she traveled a lot, with and without him. She went to church conferences. She's always, we've heard mention of the Iowa Bystander newspaper that started in the 1890s. You can find her in there a lot, only you have to know that you are searching for Mrs. You're looking for Mrs. S.B. Holly, either spelling of Holly. The V, by the way, stood for Virginia. The court case, you can't always trust these sources. The handwritten document on display in the Capitol, what I think is now on display at the what do we call it, Justice Department. In any case, the Clark versus Muscatine Schools case that we just love to celebrate in this state says that Susan, middle initial B, well, that middle initial is wrong. Speaking of middle initials, I devoted a column to this. For years, we've been seeing Alexander G. Clark. We had this discussion with Paul Finkelman, and Rebecca was in on it. There is no evidence of Alexander Clark, this Alexander Clark, having a middle initial G in his lifetime, or in fact until 1970, when the Black Law Students Organization at the University of Iowa named itself the Alexander G. Clark Jr. in Cedar Rapids. Anyway, and from 1970 on, we've been seeing both father and son with G. Alexander Jr.'s middle initial G stood for Griffith, which was his mother's maiden name. Oh, and what became of Susan? Just a little more. So she traveled widely. She's often in the bystander reported, traveling here, traveling there, sometimes with her pastor husband or going to see him. He would be assigned different places, and I'm pretty sure Mount Pleasant was one of the places I found him preaching. The congregation in Iowa City, he was one of the missionary pastors there when it was started, and Clinton, Washington, Galesburg, Champaign, Illinois. That might be it. He was all around the region. There's a particular story, one of my favorites, where Susan is not in the bystanders as an adult. She's in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and then this story is told again in the Muscatine Journal and maybe elsewhere, that there was a bad train wreck somewhere in this part of Iowa, somewhere between Cedar Rapids and Burlington. And you read on about all of the heroic first responders and the condition of the rail cars and the wounded, and there were several people who died. And then you get almost to the end of the story, and you read that a colored woman, Susan Hawley from Cedar Rapids, although slightly injured herself, got up from her seat and, devoted the rest of the evening to ministering to the wounded. That's one of the things that the Susan Clark Junior High School in Muscatine now celebrates from their heroic days. Susan Clark does not have a Wikipedia page, and when the Muscatine School Board spent several months debating what the name of the new school would be, there was a fair amount of controversy about it. One of the school board members told I was part of a committee that was going to the school board meetings every month, and the school board member wrote to me and said, it would really be helpful if there was a Wikipedia article. Well, I got started, I've done some Wikipedia writing. I got started trying to do the Susan D. Clark page. There are other Susan Clarks in the world, and she'd be like number 5. And then the ruling from the Facebook, or the Wikipedia gods, was that there was already a Facebook page, that's where I live, Facebook. There was a Wikipedia page devoted to Clark versus Muscatine Schools, 1868, telling all about the case. So we've ended up trying to load up that page with stories about her life.
How did Alexander Clark make his money?
The short version of the legend is that he got to Muscatine and he was an ingenious young entrepreneur and sold vegetables, and he was a barber. He learned barbering from his uncle in Cincinnati, I should mention that. So he had a trade. He had worked as a bartender on a steamboat on the Ohio River, Mississippi River. Kent's version, we're talking about a part 2 of this video where Kent and I sit in the studio and he tells me what I did wrong today. We connect our family stories to these things. I had abolitionist ancestors. I had people who settled in Grand, Iowa. I quickly get into the John Brown story. I don't know what my people were doing. Kent's got a thing about how his people came from Washington County, Pennsylvania, which is where Alexander Clark was born, from Washington, Pennsylvania. And so he can tell you all about the people who settled around Muscatine and Boston, who were from the same place and who were related. And he's pretty sure that there was a family connection and that Alexander had some good white allies. He was born free, by the way. His parents were emancipated, and he had a white grandfather. And in any case, for some reason, he landed in Muscatine. Kent will explain to you with the river currents why it was that the place for the boats to stop was on the Illinois side. Drury's Landing is where some of Kent's people were, and he's just sure that Alexander Clark started out serving riverboats at Drury's Landing. The first territorial legislature, our area was represented by Eli Reynolds from Muscatine, and the area where the Han Geneva plant is today is where he thought Iowa's capital was. No, he thought they were all going to build the Queen City of the West. So Eli Reynolds City was going to be in that area, and Kent believes there was a Reynolds family connection, and he can go on and on with that deal. In any case, we know that he sold wood, firewood to riverboats. I think it's in the PBS thing, somebody's talking, you can imagine young Alexander cutting firewood, peddling it to the boats. I don't think so. There were already black folks in town. We know about various ones coming through. We hear that the freedom seekers came that way. So I started saying, Alexander Clark was a job creator. Alexander Clark was a fixer. Alexander Clark was a barber. He, like I said about Mount Pleasant this morning, if you want to get your hair cut in Muscatine or your beard trimmed, you went to a black barber. There's another Underground Railroad story from out in the county, which is another black barber's family. So they were leaders of their community, and as Paul Finkelman says in the documentary, they were in the know about everything. They were cutting hair and trimming the beards, and for who? For the leaders of the community. So they heard about all the deals that were going on. They learned about how to do business. It seems that Alexander, by all accounts, it seems that he got along with everybody. Now, when he owned that newspaper, it was said that his pen was dipped in acid, and he could. Some of the things he said were really ironic. He would probably have liked President Trump's 1976 commission that was, you know, the conservative answer to the 1619 Project. You know, we're going to center American history on slavery. No, we're going to center it on 1776. Sorry. I think he would have liked a lot of the stuff they said, because he embraced all of that Declaration of Independence. We're all created equal, and he devoted a lot of his life to demanding it. We haven't talked about the Civil War. He was a recruiter for Iowa's only black regiment. He made one trip up to Fort Snelling, Minneapolis now, and recruited something like 49 men there who'd been serving as guards for Native Americans. You know about the hangings of Mankato, uprising. All these folks who were locked up there had black guards, and they were brought down to Davenport for what became Camp McClellan, now village of East Davenport. And so Alexander went to Minneapolis, recruited a bunch of those guys for the Iowa regiment, and did a lot to organize the regiment. Didn't serve himself. They gave him the title Sergeant Major, the men did apparently. He didn't serve himself because of some old injury, they say, an ankle or a leg, and he was older. But he was instrumental in all sorts of things on behalf of the regiment. He went as far as St. Louis with them when they were training before they went on to Arkansas. And he presented the flag to them, which is in the collection, the Iowa flag collection, Civil War flag collection now. The flag made by women of Muscatine and Keokuk. Why was I saying Civil War?
How he made his money.
How he made his money? Oh, I said I call him job creator. I think that he became such a leader in the black community and was so well connected and so well liked by people. That's what I was saying. The evidence is that he was charismatic. He earned the title of the Colored Orator of the West. You know, Frederick Douglass was the great colored orator. And he had an associate. He was the agent for Frederick Douglass North Star newspaper as early as 1850. He was the Iowa agent. He attended the 1853 conference Douglass organized in Rochester, New York. I mentioned the uncle in Cincinnati. He had, well, they'd be his cousins. His uncle's daughters, two of them, attended Oberlin in the 1830s.
He had a lot of real estate too.
Yeah, sorry, we're talking about money. Talking about money.
Yeah.
And, you know, I have never done that research, and I don't think anybody has systematically to know what all properties he owned when. We have figured out that connecting the dots in history revealing itself fairly late in this game. We found an article about somebody who was a member of his AME congregation and almost certainly a third great grandfather of a couple of people we know locally, including Frank Best, who's a Wise County historian, learned about his black third great grandfather, who tended Alexander Clark's farm on Muscatine Island. And we figured out that was probably inside the territory that today is Grain Processing Corporation, or maybe Muscatine Power and Water in that area. So yeah, real estate. We find, mostly I find records of, he sells things. He sold a property to daughter Rebecca. And other people. Oh, well, here's one. I don't know how much this he actually collected because we're not aware of great wealth from probate from the time of his death. But it was reported that when he got this ambassadorial post that he was getting paid $4,000. Frederick Douglass at the same time was getting paid $5,000 to be the U.S. minister to Haiti. The governor of Iowa was getting paid $3,000. There were great things about what a wealthy black. That's one reason we like to tell this story. It's not all sadness and cotton plantations. As soon as the war's over, he's traveling throughout the South. I didn't mention Masonry much, but he was a leader of the Prince Hall Masons for multiple states. And when there were different factions, he played an important role in bringing them together. So, 10 minutes, and I know that there's a short break between us and the next people, and I know I need to get all this stuff out of here. Yeah, so, any other questions or comments? You all know about Alexander Clark now, so if we say Alexander Clark slept here, that's all we need to say, right? And Lorinda's and Rebecca are getting this next